Chapter 3, Healing, Evacuation, the RAMC, and FANY. I'm just going to start with an apology. This chapter seems to have taken a bit of a change in tone. Don't really understand what happened or why. I think I was just in a different mindset when I wrote it. It focuses more on facts than the other ones. I guess I'm sort of sorry about that. But with that mentioned down, here is a breakdown of the chain of evacuation, the RAMC, and most importantly, FANY. They're not actually that important. I just think it's quite funny to say. Battlefields are quite dangerous. I feel like I've said war is dangerous quite a lot. I have. Because it is. But you know what's more dangerous than war? Evacuating the wounded from the battlefield in war. In this section, we'll discuss how the wounded are evacuated, which is also known as the chain of evacuation. We're going to try and break down each stage, where people are moved to and from, and the people who treat the wounded. The chain of evacuation is the process of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield. For the purpose of this, we're going to start with the regimental aid post, and we'll cover stretcher bearers later on in the video. Turns out I'm a liar. We'll do them now. I realised when I was editing this and putting it together that I never wrote a section about stretcher bearers and what they do. Well, I suppose everybody makes mistakes and everybody has those days. Also, apparently, alongside me not writing that section, I've gotten lazy now, so I'm just going to rip off BBC Bite Size to write this bit. Stretcher bearers recovered the dead and wounded from no man's land. Usually they'd prioritise it the other way around. They'd pick up the wounded and then the dead, because I think they preferred people who were still alive to try to save them. They would often go out at night time or during breaks in the fighting, because sometimes you get a bit fed up of shooting people or you run out of ammunition. When they arrived at a wounded soldier, they had limited equipment, usually including a bandage which they would use to apply pressure to a wounded soldier. Trying to get out to the soldiers in the battlefield led to them overcoming huge obstacles like mud, shell craters, and overcrowded trenches. But also, we have the conditions like at the Somme, where there's the tank tracks that they have to get through, so the ground becomes more uneven, or the ground from the creeping barrage, which creates these shell craters. It becomes an incredibly dangerous job. Each battalion would have 16 stretcher bearers, and a battalion's about 1,000 men, so per 1,000 men, there are 16 stretcher bearers. These broke down into 4-man teams, which were needed to carry the wounded, meaning there were 4 teams of 4. In deep mud or damp ground, like at the First Battle of Ypres, they would require more than 4 men per stretcher, sometimes using 6 or even up to 8 men in the evacuation to remove 1 wounded soldier from the battlefield. The Regimental Aid Post, or RAP, if you're down with the kids, which tragically and extremely disappointingly I've just realised I am not. So I'm going to call it the RAP from this point on. The RAP was close to the front line. It would often be set up in a dugout to accommodate 2 to 6 beds and have a single medical officer in charge of it. This medical officer was part of the RAMC, but would be under the control of the commanding officer of whichever battalion they're assigned to. The RAP would be able to hold the sick and wounded before evacuation, but they would only be able to treat small wounds, apply morphine and tourniquets for the wounded, and if essential, they might even perform an amputation here, though this was unlikely because it would have been done further back, places such as the advanced dressing station. If further care was needed or wounds could not be treated on the front line, then they would be moved to the advanced dressing station. A dressing station was set up in a tent behind the trench lines. These were run by the RAMC and were usually up to a mile behind the front line. Often they tried to use derelict buildings or dugouts, though when these weren't available, it would be the tents. They were entirely staffed by medical officers, stretcher bearers, and from 1915, they were so inclusive, they included women who were nurses. They could look after troops for up to a week. Seriously injured soldiers were moved out to a casualty clearing station by a motor or horse-drawn ambulance. More often, the horse-drawn ambulances, as they could navigate most of the destroyed roads, which the ambulances could not manage. Sometimes the advanced dressing station would carry out life-saving surgery if it was required, and they usually had more equipment than the regimental aid post. During heavy fighting, these, much like every other stage of evacuation, would be overwhelmed with the number of injured soldiers coming in. Moving further back, we have the casualty clearing station, which is the third link in the chain of evacuation. These were well equipped and often near rail lines and waterways, allowing essential supplies to get in, but also the evacuation of the wounded to the final link in the chain, the base hospitals. Though we are getting ahead of ourselves by mentioning those, because we've still got a lot to talk about. The casualty clearing station was usually several miles from the front line, and often moved with the change in front line, so they would find a suitable space to set up. They operated triage systems and prioritised and categorised the wounded. They prioritised treating life-threatening injuries for those who could survive. They would make those who were gravely wounded as comfortable, but try not to waste too many supplies on them. And they would sort of organise the people that are slightly wounded, but can wait a little bit, to go to the back of the queue. These were the most important place for the efforts to reduce the risk of infection. They tried to make aseptic operating theatres. They also would contain mobile X-ray units towards the end of the war, and had many hospital beds to improve the conditions for patients. Due to the operating theatres, they often carried out more dangerous surgeries and procedures here. The CCS would be able to treat 500 to 1,000 patients if they needed to. The size of a CCS was pretty significant. They were up to about half a mile of tents or temporary buildings and would be a common target for the German artillery due to the number of supplies held there. Those who could not be treated at the CCS or needed further care after they left it or had had something like an amputation would be moved on to the base hospitals. Some people would be transported by rail or boat, usually had slightly better conditions. Some people would travel there by ambulance and it wasn't very comfortable. Unfortunately, at the start of the war, early trains would be ordinary supply trains and were not kitted out to transport the troops well. Though, as the war went on, they began to develop ambulance trains with nurses who could go from carriage to carriage to check and treat wounded soldiers that needed it. As for the boats, the conditions were often cramped and not as sanitary as the trains. When soldiers would reach the base hospitals, which would often be near ports or on the coast, they would be treated by specialised medical staff. For example, members who focus on brain injuries to improve the treatment of that particular wound, and they all specialised in different areas. They were commonly divided into wards for this, and as such had the best treatment for the wounded. Patients could be treated here for weeks or months before being returned to the front line or Britain if required. Many of these hospitals ended up continuing to run well beyond the end of the war, with some not closing until 1921. After spending about 5 years too long establishing what the chain of evacuation is in way more detail than I ever thought I'd talk about it, we get to move on to our first group, the Royal Army Medical Corps, which, for the sake of me being lazy, because I've been trying to record this for about 2 hours now, we're going to call the RAMC. But I'm never going to say it that slowly again. This was a group that organised and provided medical care for the wounded during World War I on the Western Front. Some of their responsibilities was being doctors. That's quite surprising, isn't it? As well as helping the troops and medics to practice good sanitation to limit the number of infections. There were 113,000 members of the RAMC by 1918, and over 50% of British doctors were part of this in the armed forces in World War I. As well as this, there were 13,063 medical officers, and there was one of these per battalion, at least one of these per battalion, and they set up the regimental aid posts. Now that we've covered the RAMC, we get to move on to a much more fun-sounding group, the FANY, or I suppose it's FANY. They're the first aid nurse in yeomanry. This was a volunteer regiment of all-female nurses that set out to support the war effort. However, In the beginning of the war, the British Army would only accept people who had been professionally trained. So they weren't allowed to support the British Army. FANY were responsible for driving ambulances, administering first aid, transporting supplies like food to the front line, as well as setting up entertainment for soldiers and running mobile bath units, which really helped sort of support the cleanliness for the soldiers. They were more a propaganda piece than something that was actually practical. Initially, the British Army refused to accept the aid of this group, so they were focused on looking after the French and Belgian armies, though as the war went on, by 1916 the number of casualties had increased dramatically, probably because of battles like the Battle of the Somme, and they were desperately in need of help, leading to the British Army and the government to change their mind about using volunteer nurses. The members of FANY wore a military-style uniform, though were not part of the regular army or the Army Reserve. They were kind of just sort of dressing up as soldiers, but they were extremely welcome on the front line by the end of it. The role of the RAMC and FANY was extremely important as they saved and treated over 1.6 million men in World War I. The final organisation that we're going to mention is not as significant as FANY or the RAMC, but they may have something, or they may be mentioned in an exam, so we're just going to cover them to cover all our bases. We're going to be talking about the Voluntary Aid Detachment, or VAD. So this was a group made up of middle class and upper class women with really no experience of work. Their responsibilities would vary greatly on the front line, or on the Western Front in general, as they take on tasks such as nursing, helping in operating theatres, scrubbing floors, cooking, washing clothes, giving pain relief to soldiers, and changing dressings on wounds. They're not as likely to be mentioned as the other groups, but it's worth just knowing who they are and that they still carried out and supported the war effort. I think once again, I can only apologise for the weird sort of tone that this took. I'm not happy with it, but with less than a month until the 2023 exams, I'm just going to put it out there and maybe fix it in the future. Maybe not. This might never be touched again.